Today's book is Sapphire Blue by Kerstin Gier, and it is the second in the Ruby Red trilogy. Sorry, this is not two. It is the second in the Ruby Red trilogy, and I realized last time I should have worn something red. So for Emerald Green, I'm going to try to find something green, but blue is my color, so we'll find out. I don't know if it's because I have a slight obsession with a certain song right now, and so that's the only thing running through my mind. Or if it's because all of the books in this trilogy run together so seamlessly, I could not remember what Sapphire Blue was about. And I only finished it a couple days ago. But I'm almost done with Emerald Green, and then I've started another book, and I finished another book, so I just need to be more on my game with this kind of stuff. Bear with me if I ramble a little bit. I did make notes for this one. Sapphire Blue. If you missed my first review of Ruby Red, go watch it. But a short overview, because this is a trilogy that you do have to read in order to understand it. So Ruby Red, we meet a 16-year-old girl named Gwen Shepherd who learns that she's a time traveler. It was thought that her cousin Charlotte was going to be the time traveler in the family, and so Charlotte had been bred to understand and be prepared for that moment when her time traveling gene kicked in, but turns out it's Gwen. And so in Ruby Red, we meet Gwen, who is the 12th of 12 time travelers, and her corresponding gem is the ruby. And the whole deal with what they're trying to do is the 9th and 10th time travelers, Lucy and Paul, had stolen something called the chronograph, which is what enables time travelers to have controlled time travel. Thankfully, there's a second chronograph, but Gwen's male counterpart, because there's always a female and a male, so her counterpart, Gideon, for the last 2 years had been traveling through time trying to collect blood from each of the previous time travelers, because there's this whole deal about what happens if the blood from all the time travelers is fed into the chronograph. And essentially the assumption is that there is a sorcerer's stone hidden within it, and then that can heal all illnesses. That's what they are essentially doing in the first book. This whole trilogy takes place in a matter of weeks. I want to say 2 weeks. I think it might be more like a month. Picks up right after that. And what has happened was Gideon had been trying to get the blood from one of Gwen's ancestors, Lady... I can't remember her name right now. Anyways, because, you know, males are descended from the males, the females are descended from the females. So he had been trying to get her ancestors' blood, and the woman would not give it to him. But then she said, you know what, if you bring Gwen, maybe we can talk. He brings Gwen, and they are ambushed by Lucy and Paul. However, Gideon, anticipating this sort of thing, had brought a gun with him, and then he takes Lucy hostage so that he and Gwen can get away, but not before Lucy tells Gwen, look, things aren't as they seem. You need to ask your grandpa about the Green Rider. So we pick up here with that in Gwen's head. I guess because she was not bred in this world of mystery and intrigue, she's a lot more trusting, and so she's like, maybe Lucy and Paul had a good reason for stealing the chronograph. She sets about trying to uncover the secret. Through the process of this, spoiler, she and Gideon start to fall in love. If you know me, if you've seen previous reviews, you know my feelings about that, especially because this is like week 2 of them knowing each other. Granted, the time traveling does make it feel like a longer period of time, even though, because the time travelers have to elapse for at least 3 hours a day. Even though if they're set to go back to the 1950s, when they come back to their time, only 3 hours has passed. So it's not like they have actually elongated their day. But the time travel does make it feel like they've known each other more, or that they've known each other longer, that they know each other better. In any case, that is a subplot. So there's the big baddie / not baddie. That's a spoiler, I guess. Count San Germain, or Germain. Count San Germain? I think that sounds right. That feels right in my mouth, at least. So he is the guy who, he was like 5th in the time traveler line, and he figured out all these things, and he's the guy who is trying to create a philosopher's stone, and he's the one who came up with the whole chronograph thing, which this is my second read through, and the first time was years ago. So there's a lot that I don't remember from my first read through. But one thing I haven't quite understood is how he knows about the chronograph and what's inside the chronograph, because it doesn't sound like he created the chronograph or the 2 chronographs. So I am actually really confused as to how he came across some of his information and how they came across these chronographs. Because if he was trying to create a philosopher's stone, why would he need to get at a philosopher's stone that's inside the chronograph? Maybe I just missed that part. In any case, then there's Count San Germain, and he's the guy pulling all the strings. He's the one telling the secret society that surrounds the time travelers what to do, where to send the kids, what he needs. He is the reason that Paul and Lucy stole the original chronograph, which is now what Gwen is trying to figure out. Like, why would they distrust Count San Germain? Because this is early 2000s, like 2011. He was 1700s. This then, let me put my arm in front of my face, okay? This then leads her to her grandfather, Lucas Montrose, who had died when she was young. Oh, although, let me tell you, and this is a minor spoiler, I think I forgot to mention it in my last review. Her parents are not her parents. We learn at the end of Ruby Red, because each book starts with a prologue, ends with an epilogue. We learned in the epilogue, if you're paying attention, that Paul and Lucy are Gwen's parents. So technically, Lucas is her great-grandfather. But so she starts to meet with him in various periods of time because she is able to manipulate the Guardians into sending her back to a time when he would be alive. And so then they're kind of figuring things out together because she kind of meets him a little too early for him to actually have any information. So she begins to tell him, hey, these are things I need to know. And then he says, hey, come back to me later. Eventually she does, and she is able to recover the second chronograph, because one thing that was bothering me, and I must have just glazed over it when I was listening to it, the Green Rider. I was like, what in the world does the Green Rider have to do with anything? Because Gwen has a best friend named Leslie, who's sort of the information guru. And Leslie had found a copy of a book called The Green Rider. You know, through all of her research, she could not figure out what this was, but her best lead was a book. However, that book gave no clues. And then they discovered that Lucas, that the grandfather, had owned a copy of The Green Rider. And inside of it was a piece of paper with geographical coordinates. I think that's what they're called. So from there, they're able to discover that the coordinates lead to Gwen's house, which is her familial home. It is still owned by her grandmother, so ergo, that's where her grandfather used to live. So they're able to get the second chronograph and bloody blah. I forgot where I was. Gwen starts to distrust Count San Germain largely because in the previous book, he had used mind control and a bit of telekinesis to strangle her. So yeah, she's not his biggest fan. Then she starts to realize that maybe he's not as kind-hearted as this whole secret society is painting him to be. That's what we get in Emerald Green. But Sapphire Blue, kind of ends with Gideon saying, sorry, I've got the little wings now. Gideon saying the L word right before they meet with Count San Germain. Gideon goes off on some other errand, and then while Gwen is talking to him, Count San Germain, he tells her, wow, Gideon really played his part well. What part is that? Making you fall in love with him and pretending that he loves you back. Because what's the best way to manipulate a woman? Feed off her emotions. Make her fall in love with you. Can we get an amen? Yeah. So that is essentially where we leave off, because then Gwen and Gideon return to their time. She confronts him about it. He doesn't deny it, and then she spends the rest of the book heartbroken. We also get an introduction to this other fella named Lord Alistair, who is from Count Saint Germain's time, and Lord Alistair hates the time travelers, and he is the head of the Florentine Alliance, and their goal is to wipe out the time traveler line. I'm gonna get a little bit ahead of myself. There are these little snippets from journal entries, and what we learn is that this Italian guy, his daughter was at a monastery and she gets pregnant. By all accounts, it was by the devil. In reality, it was a time traveler who hopefully I remember to tell you who that is in the last book. But still, her dad is like, he's still devil's spawn, if not the devil himself, and so I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to bring him and his kind down. This hatred gets passed down the line all the way through, I think, even to Gwen's time. It doesn't really matter in Gwen's time, because in Gwen's time, the villain is someone completely different. But that is who Gwen and Gideon have to battle in Emerald Green, but I'm still getting ahead of myself. So yeah, I liked Sapphire Blue, particularly because, putting it out here, I really enjoy the entire series. It's lighthearted, it's easy, it is fun, it's enjoyable, like it's great storytelling, beautifully written, but there are some issues, as always. And so with Ruby Red, as much as I liked it, I did find myself wondering, what is the point? Because it was very, very fast. And just like with Ruby Red, I thought Sapphire Blue ended a bit abruptly. I was not ready for it to end. So in both cases, I was not ready for it to end in a good way. In Ruby Red, in retrospect, I was not ready for it to end in a bad way, because I felt like it wasn't a complete book in a sense, because when I sat back and thought about it, I couldn't figure out what it was trying to achieve. Because the thing about all three books is it does feel like Ruby Red is the first third, Sapphire Blue is the middle, and then Emerald Green is the last third. So that's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because particularly with Ruby Red, as I said, I couldn't figure out the purpose. It set up the other books, but each book has to have its own plot, and I couldn't quite figure it out. So that all going back to say, Sapphire Blue was a big improvement on that. It did have a beginning, middle, end. There were problems that needed to be resolved. There were problems that were resolved. There were problems that were not resolved, which then leads to Emerald Green. My two biggest issues, one stems from Ruby Red and will continue into Emerald Green. Two is one that is just a personal problem for me. And so the first one is her cousin Charlotte and her Aunt Glenda, and then her grandmother, Lady Arista. They just felt really flat. Like they're there just to cause problems, yet I couldn't figure out why, what the motivation for that was. The easy answer and the obvious answer is jealousy. But there was nothing to prove that, which is where my problem comes in. I might have to get ahead of myself. I'm gonna get ahead of myself. So when Gwen finds the second chronograph, because Paul and Lucy, the thing is, if you time travel with a chronograph, you can't go back to your own time. So they had obviously time traveled into a point where they gave the chronograph to Lucas, and he then hid it in his house. So after she finds this chronograph and can do her own independent time traveling, she sees this interaction between him and Lady Arista, and they seem to have a loving relationship. So at this moment, I'm thinking, okay, she's not all bad, and I don't know, maybe somehow she's gonna come to accept Gwen. But then we get back to the present, and she still treats Gwen like a second-class citizen, like somehow Charlotte is better. There are definitely moments where she says, Glenda, shut your mouth, quit causing problems. It is what it is. So because Gwen is not prepared for time traveling, which is essentially learning how to fence, learning how to play piano, learning antiquated manners and this and that and the other, and learning history, Lady Arista doesn't think that Gwen is worth much, and that falls in line with Charlotte and Glenda not thinking that Gwen is worth much. Personally, I think Gwen is hilarious. She's a breath of fresh air. When you read all of these books with really serious protagonists, and I see nothing wrong with her, except, yeah, she might be a little bit silly and she prefers movies to reading or something. So I don't understand why, when it's not her fault, she didn't know that her mother lied about her heritage or her parentage or her birth date. So being unprepared, not her fault, yet everybody treats her like scum. My other problem with the whole time travel thing is, because Gwen wasn't supposed to have the time travel gene, she wasn't allowed to know anything about what went on behind closed doors, like all the lessons that Charlotte learned and this and that and the other. Even though she knows that time travel exists, anywho. But so I guess Glenda saw this time travel gene as something to be proud of, as something to be desired. And maybe it's also feeding off of the ill will because Gwen's mother had helped Lucy and Paul escape with the chronograph. And so we're still feeding off of 17 years worth of bad blood. But yeah, so Glenda, she just comes after Gwen all the time, as does Charlotte. And I get really irritated because we're only allowed to assume, particularly Charlotte, that there's the jealousy factor. That not only is Gwen the special one now, but she gets to spend time with Gideon, who is Charlotte's secret love. And I really got irritated that we never got anything more, or that nobody was ever put in their place about their behavior. Sure, Grace, Gwen's mother, would speak up for herself, or for Gwen, but Lady Arista, who's the one with all the power, never went at Glenda and said, look, there's nothing we can do about it. She's the time traveler. No, nobody ever put Glenda in her place. Nobody ever put Charlotte in her place. And there was a heavy favoritism for Charlotte. So she was treated with kid gloves and whatnot. And so she could say, oh, I don't feel well. And everybody's like, oh, poor you. Whereas Gwen, who, I don't understand this either, essentially from the moment she reveals that she's the time traveler, has no time to sleep. But they're like, oh, you're fine. You're just faking it. Why are you trying to get attention from Charlotte? If they live in the same house, it is plausible that they could have gotten the same illness. So and it happened in Ruby Red, happens in Sapphire Blue, continues in Emerald Green, and I'm waiting for an explanation. I'm waiting for a reason to sympathize with Charlotte, to sympathize with Glenda, to sympathize with Lady Arista. And it's not coming, and I feel like the third book in is too late for me to have a reason for why these women behave the way they do. Anywho, my other problem, the personal problem, is the L word. Gideon is 18. Gwen is 16. And while we eventually realize, and this is what makes it okay for me, is at the end we learn that it was all pretend for Gideon. I cannot stand when teenagers claim to be in love, particularly when they don't even know each other. Literally 2 weeks of acquaintanceship does not equal love, particularly when most of the time Gideon treats Gwen with disdain. And that is something that I forgot to mention for this plot. When we end with Ruby Red, we end with him kissing her. We see that, hey, maybe he likes her, and we kind of continue that. And then Gwen elapses, meets with Lucas, comes back, learns, or actually I think she learned this before she elapsed, but Gideon had been sent on a time travel mission and somebody had knocked him over the head. So when she returns, he's super suspicious of her. And she cannot figure out why he's treating her like dirt. He reveals, well, you did it to me. And she's like, I didn't do it to you. And he says, well, your future self did it to me in the past. And I'm like, okay, get mad at her later. She hasn't done it yet. So why are you mad at her now? From this point on, from when he gets hit over the head, and he even admits, because what he says is he saw Gwen and she lured him around a corner and then somebody knocked him out. However, it possibly could not have been Gwen because she would have been strong enough to hit him with that much force. Yet he still blames her. I'd say almost halfway through is when Gideon gets hit over the head. And then towards the end again is when he says the L word. Because I don't remember what it is. Somehow he comes to see reason. Sorry, I've got this really funny part here. And it's, I guess that's my cowlick. Or maybe that is just where I've been parting my hair for so long. Anyways. So for the majority of the first book, they don't see eye to eye. For almost half of this book, they don't see eye to eye. Yet they're in love. Some of that I can't talk about yet because it's not part of this book, and I'm trying really hard not to get too ahead of myself because this is a review of Sapphire Blue, okay? This is not a review of the series as a whole, although I did think about doing that because, as I said, they sort of feel like one book if you put them all together. There is another character within this secret society who is in charge of history, in charge of dancing. Because Gwen has so much catching up to do, obviously, she fails miserably. She fails miserably. And I don't remember which book it's covered in, if it is this book or Emerald Green, but they do address the obvious, which is why do things have to happen so fast if we essentially have all of time to take care of it? I mean, really, like, I can go back to yesterday, today, tomorrow, 50 years from now. It all turns out the same. So, yes, like, why can't we give Gwen more time? And the explanation is because Count San Germain says so. This guy, Mr. Giordani, sorry, I can't say that name either. It's so funny the things that you hear, you read, yet you can't pronounce, because you never say it. Mr. Giordano, that's what it was, not Giordano. That's why it felt weird, because I had it wrong. Sorry, I'm getting so off track here. It's ridiculous. But my brain, for some reason, cannot focus on Sapphire Blue today. So, Mr. Giordano likes to pick at her, and Charlotte likes to pick at her because she's trying to cram hundreds of years worth of information and etiquette into an afternoon. And again, just like with Lady Arista and Glenda and Charlotte, nobody puts them in their place. Nobody says, look, simmer down. But all the men within the society, I guess maybe it comes down from the antiquated notions of women have their place, or maybe, I think there's something written somewhere about, because whenever Gwen is taken down to the room where she elapses from, she always has to be blindfolded, because it's written that way, even though they don't know it's Gwen. But I feel like, okay, so even if they were blindfolding Charlotte, which I can't say they were, because if that's where she was going to elapse from and she hadn't elapsed yet, I don't know why she would have gone down there. But I feel like they treat Gwen with much more suspicion than they ever treated Charlotte. But again, Giordano, I don't understand why he's able to pick at Gwen the way he does. In the grand scheme of things, when it comes down to needing an antagonist, I do understand why Charlotte, Giordano, Lady Arista, Glenda, Gideon, why all the men in society are rude to Gwen. I do. I see that. But in terms of execution, I don't see that, because there's never an explanation. There's never any let up. And it's just really frustrating for me for people to be bad just because they're bad. Because I've discussed this before, where we're not bad because we're bad. There's always a reason behind why we do what we do. That's what makes us human. That's what makes characters well-rounded. And I was always very ready to skip ahead during those parts, because it felt so foundationless and easy. I say that a lot. I'm going to continue saying it. It's just too easy. And if something is too easy in a book, is it because the author was too lazy to work harder? The only other real point, oh my goodness. So I love this dress and I love this ring, but the tines keep picking my dress, and that is so annoying because it pulls the thread. Back to the book. There's Zaberius. So one of Gwen's abilities is to be able to see ghosts and demons / gargoyles. I say demons / gargoyles because I can't discern if they are distinct entities or if the gargoyles are physical incarnations of the demons, although she's still the only person who can see them. So then there's Zaberius. So Zaberius is a demon in the shape of a gargoyle. He thinks he is a lot scarier than he actually is. And so he is really fun. He's comic relief. Although I definitely question his necessity. There are times where he is helpful because since nobody else can see him, he can eavesdrop on conversations and he can get information for Gwen. Although it doesn't help, or it doesn't happen enough for me to say, yes, we need Zaberius. Except that he's just funny. Anywho, I could do without these prologues and epilogues. They do give me a glimpse into two characters who were essentially the catalysts for the entire series. Because if you know anything about writing, you have a key event and then you have an inciting incident. So the inciting incident is what sets the whole story in motion. So this whole story is set in motion. The whole trilogy is set in motion because Paul and Lucy steal the original chronograph, which means Gideon and Gwen have to then recollect all this blood. They are important because we wouldn't have a story without them, but at the same time, I sit through those chapters and think, why am I sitting through them? Yeah. Like, subscribe, comment, do all the stuff that lets me know, hey, you know, it's alright to continue sitting in front of a computer and talking to myself, pretending that I'm you. I'll see you later. Bye.